All right. Before I get to part 2 of Matthew chapter 13, my phone, I think it ran out of space. I think that's why it stopped recording. So I deleted some old photos and did this upload thing for some other photos, and gonna try and do some things differently here in the future. But I got a lot of space on my phone, but I'm gonna look for some external storage options as well. Anyways, kind of crazy, but yeah, I'm not the most techie person in the world. In some ways, I reject some of the technology. So I wanted to address this media thing that I have in my heart, and I'm going to be going to work here fairly soon. So I wanted to get okay, so I wanted to get this out while I'm thinking about it. Twin Cities TV has some excellent stories, and it follows, network TV in general. Channel 5 is currently ABC, KSTP, and they did some work early on in really creating TV news as we know it, and they were pioneers in television in many regards. If you look at the KSTP TV Wikipedia page, I think it explains some of that. Look at the Hubbard Broadcasting website. It's interesting. But they were once an NBC affiliate, and they actually had a disagreement with NBC back in the 70s and switched from NBC to ABC. There's more to the story, but I just find it interesting how things change over time. In my lifetime, I was born in 77, back in the around the year 2000 or so, give or take, UPN was on channel 29, or was on channel 9, and moved over to 29, and Fox, which was on 29, moved over to channel 9, because at that point Fox Corporation owned both channels, and that has to do with the rise and fall of UPN, the network. And Channel 29 originally was supposed to be for Hastings, and I've talked about channel capacity, radio station capacity, and whatnot. I won't go into that a lot because I want to try and make these videos shorter. But back historically, TV, the VHF only had channels 2 through 13, 12 spots. You had to space out channels. Now there's a small gap between channel 4 and 5, a bigger gap between 6 and 7, and a really big gap between 13 and 14, 14 being UHF. So you had 12 possible channels, but in the same market back then with analog TV, they couldn't be right next to each other. So you might have, something like in the Twin Cities. We had channel 2, 4, 5, 9, and 11. And then, later there was 17, 23, 29, 41, 45, and now there's a few smaller stations that also exist. But the networks are an interesting thing because basically TV started with NBC. Now there was other competition and other factors. CBS started not long after. NBC actually divided into two networks, NBC Red and NBC Blue. And this was, keep in mind, the radio still. The three major TV networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, all started as radio networks. Fox was the only one that started later and had no radio network directly affiliated with it. But, so NBC, the government split up NBC, and NBC, which was under the control of General Electric and RCA, and it gets complicated. But they had to split up, so they kept the Red Network, which was the better shows, and that became the NBC, well, maybe not we know today, but the main NBC. And the Blue Network became ABC, and the Life, the fruit, the little Life fruit company, the gum chewy things, the person who owned that company bought the Blue Network, and it became ABC, the American Broadcasting Company. Well, NBC, the National Broadcasting Company, was a separate entity. The Colombian Broadcasting System, CBS, was, unrelated. CBS and Westinghouse were basically one entity. Again, all this is more complicated, but to simplify it all, NBC was basically part of General Electric most of its existence. CBS was part of Westinghouse most of its existence. And ABC was another independent company. And because originally only 5 full-power TV stations were allowed in each market, and because of the mandate of the government that there be educational, what became PBS, was in every market, at least one channel, there's only 4 commercial TV stations left in any market, and it took VHF a long time to first be established and then to be commercially viable. The cost of operating was greater, so a lot of the UHF stations, 14 and above, never got the traction, or at least rarely got traction that the VHF stations did. So you had a limited amount of channel space and radio was kind of similar, but there was more channel space on who affiliated with what network. But the Channel 29 in the Twin Cities was Fox. At one point, Channel 9 had Fox, and then it dropped it, and then Channel 29 picked it up, and then Channel 9 was independent for most of my early life, and it was owned by a company that helped start the UPN network. And but when it had the ABC affiliation, it was one of the major 3. So CBS had some ownership stake in WCCO, and that was still Channel 4. NBC was on KSTP Channel 5, and ABC was on Channel 9. Channel 11 was actually carrying for a while the Dumont network, which was the first attempt at a 4th network. In many ways, Fox replaced the Dumont network. But it was hard because NBC basically had all the good channels, and CBS kind of struggled to get the next best channels, and then ABC struggled from there. And similar kind of history with the radio and the TV. There's a lot of correlation, but I'm focused more on TV at this point. And then Dumont just really got stuck with the leftovers and just did not compete. It had some good shows from my understanding, but a lot of what they had successful got picked up by other networks, and it eventually folded. And to some degree, the UPN network is a successor to it also. The UPN network, of course, folded along with the WB network, which folded, and they created the CW network, Columbia Warner, for the 2 companies, the Colombian Broadcasting System, CBS, and the Warner Brothers, WB networks, CW, Columbia Warner. Anyways, that network is basically changed significantly since it's owned now by a station group, and they're changing their focus, similar to what ION has done. It was a hard battle for all these networks to get established and to get affiliations, and there was a battle in, not like a war fighting battle, but, in a very legal sense, in a money economic sense, and it was hard to get ratings. I think you're seeing kind of the same battle with streaming services in a way today. It's very different because in theory, everybody could start a streaming service. I mean, all you need is basically a server, and to be fair, if you're going to host video and a lot of video and have a lot of viewers, you need a lot more service structure than, one simple desktop computer acting as a server, because it's going to crash. But in theory, it's a lot easier for people to share video and whatnot. And the paid streaming services, people are only willing to spend so much money, and I don't know. I just find it interesting. I really want to do a longer video, but as my phone is running out of space, I'm going to rectify that here eventually. But Channel 23 had an interesting history also. It was originally a paid service because the FCC allowed that. It was scrambled. The people who owned 107.9, which at one time was K-Twin Radio, this is before the poll lads were involved with 96.3, had a partnership arrangement with Channel 23. 23 at one point created Mystery Science Theater 3000 and had some influence in helping create other shows kind of like it. So it was a leader. Channel 11 was independent for many years, and it had a kids show in the afternoon. They had like a morning, an afternoon, and an after-school edition. Casey's Roundhouse, and he was a fictional train engineer, and him and his sidekick would play cartoons, tell jokes, do little skits, and it was live, local, independent, unique television. And eventually NBC, when it lost affiliation on KSTP, went to Channel 11, and some of the independent programs disappeared. You know, it's more complicated than that, but, you know, there's a limited amount of TV channels, and even as we get cable TV, you know, it multiplied, but it kind of peaked, and now it's going back down. And I do see some great promise in television to come, because the DRM is an issue on the new Television Standard 3, which is coming out now in a limited way, but because they can lock down signals and whatnot, if the law is going to allow that and how that all plays out, we'll see. But the capacity is so much greater. With the analog TV, you have to keep the signals more apart. With digital TV, they're closer, and you can have sub-channels. For instance, you know, MeTV is, for the most part, in most areas, it's on, whatever channel number. In the Twin Cities, I think it's 5.3. Oftentimes, it's, 10.2, 12.2, whatever. But with all these digital subchannels, there's a lot more competitors. With the first digital television standard, they skipped number 2 because it didn't work the way they expected. So with Television Standard 3, there's going to be a lot more capacity because it's going to be broadcast more like an internet signal, and you can kind of hook into whichever stream you want. And again, a lot of technical detail. Some of it I don't even understand necessarily, but to boil it down, not easy to do. Assuming the DRM issues are resolved and we have free live over-the-air TV. Now I know Disney is kind of in the falling apart financial stage right now, but I mean, one thing that I could see is like, Disney could have their over-the-air affiliation with ABC, and then ESPN could be on, like, for the Twin Cities market, maybe it'd be on 5.20. And you'd have to pay for 5.20 because there's so much more capacity for TV, radio, and other things. It's more on demand as possible. So I think the cable industry is going to be basically available on broadcast because of this great capacity. Now, some of the numbers are hard to follow exactly what's possible, but I've heard something like with just something like 2% of the bandwidth, you could do 100 radio stations, audio-only radio stations. So if you're using up the full bandwidth, you could do, 5. Oh boy, math. When I sit and think about it, I'm okay. But when I try and do it on the spot, sometimes I get a little nervous. But anyways, so I mean, if you got, 2% represents 100 channels. 20% would represent 1,000 channels. So, I mean, there's a huge potential room for radio if it just goes radio. Now, if it's TV, I don't know how many channels are possible, if it's all TV signals, how much internet and how much on demand they're going to use, but there's a lot of great possibilities in the future, assuming it remains largely free. You know, content creators tend to be greedy, sports companies, and there tends to be a lot of greed. But the reason why I'm doing this video, and there's more I want to say, but I'm trying to bubble it down into this. I think we in the Christian world need to be more involved in media and entertainment. And TV and cable and satellite and all these things may be expensive, and radio is expensive, but I think to the degree we can, we should start media companies, invest into media companies, do the reverse of what companies like BlackRock are doing with their ESG score. And I'm not saying just preaching and teaching, just Christian music, just Christian movies. I think we need to be an influence on the culture, and I think there's a lot of things we could do with our families and with small business, but these are some of the things on my heart. Hopefully later tonight I'm going to finish Matthew 13, and maybe tomorrow on Monday read some more and do some more commentary. But this has been an episode of Media Unlike Christian. I'm Brian Link, your host, and keep in mind, my vision is not to be some YouTuber or some preacher or whatever. My objection is more about inspiring others to do it and creating companies that would help others to do such. So we'll talk more about that on other videos. Have a good day.